In the summer of 1945, the world was breathing a cautious sigh of relief. The Second World War was finally over, the Axis powers had fallen, and the hope of peace, fragile and fleeting, spread across continents. Yet in the Korean peninsula, what awaited the people was a new kind of uncertainty. A conflict born not from conquest, but from ideology, from global powers shaping the fate of a small nation. For 35 years, Korea had been under the harsh rule of Imperial Japan. The Japanese Empire had enforced its language, its culture, and its laws, suppressing Korean identity, traditions, and institutions. By the time Japan surrendered to the Allies on August 15, 1945, the Korean people were free from foreign rule, yet the freedom felt hollow. The country lay devastated, cities in ruins, transportation networks destroyed, food scarce, millions of lives lost or disrupted. Immediately, the geopolitical vacuum created by Japan's defeat became a battleground in miniature. The Allies had agreed that Korea would be temporarily divided for administrative purposes. The 38th parallel was drawn as a line of convenience, a marker to separate the Soviet forces advancing from the north and the American forces occupying the south. It was meant to be temporary, a simple military demarcation, not a permanent division. Yet it would shape the destiny of millions. In the north, the Soviets began installing a communist administration under Kim Il-sung, a former guerrilla fighter with experience in both Japanese-occupied Korea and in the Soviet Red Army. He had charisma, ambition, and a vision for a socialist Korea. His regime quickly consolidated power, land reforms were implemented, dissent was suppressed, and the military was rebuilt with Soviet support. Meanwhile, in the South, the United States oversaw the establishment of a government under Syngman Rhee, a staunch anti-communist, educated abroad, with years spent advocating for Korean independence. He was elected president of the newly formed Republic of Korea in 1948. But his administration faced enormous challenges. Corruption was widespread, political instability rampant, and the threat from the north loomed constantly. Between the 38th parallel, life continued, but uneasily. Families were divided. Some towns were cut in half, communication and travel were limited. Spies and secret police monitored the population, and tension simmered beneath the surface. Ordinary Koreans found themselves caught in a web of international politics, unsure of who to trust, unsure of what the future held. The late 1940s were a period of growing unrest. The North supported communist guerrilla activity in the South, attempting to destabilize Rhee's government. South Korea responded with increasingly harsh measures, political purges, arrests, and violent crackdowns. The peninsula seemed like a powder keg, and the world watched, half a continent away, unaware of the storm about to break. By 1949, the Soviet Union and the United States had solidified their spheres of influence. North Korea had become a well-armed, tightly controlled state. The Korean People's Army was trained, equipped, and ready. South Korea, though backed by the U.S., was less organized, fragmented militarily and politically. Both sides believed they could eventually unify the peninsula under their ideology. At this time, the people of Korea carried on with their lives, tending fields, rebuilding homes, attending schools. Children played in streets scarred by decades of war. Merchants reopened shops, farmers returned to the land, and communities tried to restore a sense of normalcy. Yet fear and suspicion were constant companions. No one knew who might be a spy, or a sympathizer, or an informer. The invisible lines of ideology were sharper than any drawn on a map. Kim Il-sung, determined to reunify Korea under communism, petitioned the Soviet leadership for permission to attack the South. Stalin hesitated, wary of direct conflict with the United States, but he eventually gave tacit approval, believing that a swift, decisive strike might succeed before the Americans could respond fully. Kim's confidence grew, and plans were meticulously drawn, logistics considered, artillery positioned, tanks prepared, soldiers trained in secrecy. Meanwhile, in the South, Rhee and his advisors sensed the danger. But they underestimated the scale of the threat. They focused on political consolidation, economic recovery, and forming an administrative state. The South Korean military, though courageous, lacked the numbers, equipment, and experience to repel a full-scale invasion. The stage was set, the tension unbearable, the Korean peninsula, scarred by colonial rule, divided by foreign powers, and now ready to erupt in war. Every passing day brought the two sides closer to confrontation, and for the ordinary people, the coming storm would be sudden, merciless, and transformative. As the calendar turned toward June 1950, troops in the north prepared quietly, ammunition stockpiled, maps studied, intelligence gathered across the 38th parallel. South Korean soldiers remained on alert, but most were unprepared, their minds on politics and survival rather than the possibility of a massive invasion. And so the peninsula waited, silently, tens of millions of lives suspended in anticipation. As the world itself held its breath, the clash between communism and democracy, between North and South, between ideology and survival, was about to begin. June 25, 1950, began like any other summer day in Korea, the air warm, the streets alive with the sounds of life attempting to continue. But beneath the surface, a storm was gathering, one that would change the lives of millions forever. In the early hours of that morning, tens of thousands of North Korean soldiers crossed the 38th parallel, tanks rolled forward, artillery fired, and the sky above carried the ominous roar of military aircraft. It was a full-scale invasion, meticulously planned and brutally executed. The South Korean Army, known as the Republic of Korea Army, numbered around 100,000 troops, poorly equipped, undertrained, and scattered across the peninsula. They had been warned vaguely of possible aggression, but few expected an attack of this magnitude. Seoul, the capital, was quickly threatened. North Korean forces advanced with remarkable speed, using Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks, a weapon the South had almost no experience facing. Infantry followed, moving through towns and villages, taking control of roads and railways, capturing weapons and supplies. South Korean soldiers fought bravely, attempting to hold bridges, defend cities, and delay the advance. But the North's coordination and firepower were overwhelming. Entire units were overrun, communications disrupted, commanders cut off from their men. Panic spread, soldiers retreated in disarray, civilians fled in terror, families separated. Homes abandoned, the streets filled with chaos and smoke. Eyewitnesses would later describe tanks rolling through villages, soldiers moving with precision, the thunder of artillery shaking the ground, screams and cries of civilians caught in the crossfire, buildings collapsing under bombardment. The reality of modern mechanized warfare had arrived. Unrelenting, merciless, the South Korean government, in Seoul, desperate and uncertain, scrambled to respond. President Syngman Rhee called for reinforcements. Radios crackled with orders. But the army was stretched thin. Communication lines had already been severed in many areas. The capital itself would soon face direct assault. Across the border, North Korean forces executed a coordinated strategy, cutting off roads, encircling towns, and forcing South Korean troops into defensive pockets. The goal was rapid conquest, to prevent the South from organizing a coherent counterattack. It was warfare at its most brutal, precise, and terrifying. Meanwhile, American military advisors in South Korea, about 500 personnel, observed the initial attacks. They reported back to Washington, urgent messages warning of the speed and ferocity of the North Korean advance. But bureaucratic delays and disbelief slowed the initial response. The world would soon see how fast a war could spiral out of control. The city of Seoul, only a few miles from the 38th parallel, faced immediate danger. North Korean divisions moved in from multiple directions. Tanks smashed through defensive positions. Infantry pushed through streets, civilian casualties mounted. The South Korean government considered evacuation. Leaders packed essential documents and prepared to flee, panic intertwined with courage as news spread. Refugees streamed southward. Hundreds of thousands fled the advancing north, entire families walking days, carrying what they could, witnessing towns destroyed along the way. The roads clogged with wagons, carts, and people. Hunger and exhaustion set in, disease threatened to spread. Yet the will to survive kept them moving. The South Korean army attempted counterattacks, small-scale offensives to retake towns, to slow the northern advance. But the superior equipment and training of the North Korean People's Army made these efforts almost impossible. Many soldiers were captured, others scattered. Some units refused to surrender, fighting until the last man. Stories of valor and tragedy emerged from villages and bunkers alike. At the same time, the North's plan relied heavily on speed, and shock tanks broke through defenses. Artillery destroyed positions before soldiers could regroup. Propaganda spread through captured towns. North Korean officers warned civilians of the consequences of resistance. Intimidation was a weapon as potent as any rifle. The United Nations, observing from afar, initially responded with statements of concern condemning aggression. But practical action was delayed. Only the United States had the capacity to intervene rapidly. And yet the speed of the invasion left little time for preparation. By the end of the first week, North Korean forces had captured Seoul. The South Korean government was in retreat. Remaining troops fell back toward the southeast corner of the peninsula, desperate to establish a defensive perimeter. Morale was low. Fear and exhaustion gripped both soldiers and civilians. Throughout this chaos, stories of heroism emerged. Soldiers sacrificing themselves to cover retreats, civilians hiding the wounded, entire villages attempting to resist with whatever weapons they could muster. These acts, though small in scale compared to the sweeping advance, would be remembered as testaments to courage amid despair. Meanwhile, President Ri appealed to the United States for immediate assistance. Washington responded with urgency, mobilizing air and naval support, sending advisors, and beginning preparations for full military involvement. The Korean War, initially a local conflict, was about to become a global confrontation. By mid-July, the North had pushed nearly to the Pusan region, the southeast corner of Korea, where UN and South Korean forces would attempt a last-ditch stand. The pace of war had shocked the world. Mechanized assault, tanks, artillery, and human cost were staggering. The invasion had achieved its initial objectives, yet the stage for a prolonged and brutal struggle was being set. As the smoke settled, South Korea braced for the next phase. The world had witnessed how swiftly a nation could be overwhelmed, how fragile borders could be, and how ordinary lives could be caught in the machinery of war. The North had struck, the South had fallen back, and the Korean peninsula was aflame. By August 1950, the situation for South Korea and the United Nations forces had become dire. The North Korean People's Army had advanced relentlessly, sweeping through towns, cities, and villages, leaving destruction in their wake. South Korean forces had been pushed to the southeastern corner of the peninsula, around the port city of Pusan, a small area roughly one-tenth of the country, where the last organized defense could be mounted. The Pusan perimeter was hastily fortified, trenches dug, artillery positioned. Supply lines stretched thin, soldiers exhausted, morale wavering. Civilians streamed into the region seeking safety, creating overcrowded conditions. Hospitals overwhelmed, food scarce, the air thick with fear and uncertainty. General Walton Walker, commander of the 8th Army, assumed leadership of the UN forces, primarily composed of South Korean soldiers, with American divisions reinforcing them. He understood the stakes. If Pusan fell, the entire peninsula would be under North Korean control. There would be no way to regroup, no hope for counterattack, and potentially millions of civilians trapped in the north. The North Korean army continued their advance, using their T-34 tanks to devastating effect. Infantry moved behind armored columns, supported by artillery. Every village and town along the way seized with precision. UN forces struggled to adapt. The terrain, rivers, hills, and narrow roads, were both a hindrance and a potential advantage. Defensive positions had to be carefully chosen. Every ridge and river crossing could become a battleground from the very beginning. The fighting at the perimeter was intense. Battles erupted at Naktung Bulge, Tagu, and the surrounding mountains. Soldiers on both sides endured scorching heat during the day and near-freezing temperatures at night. Supply shortages meant that some units lacked proper food, water, and ammunition. Exhaustion set in quickly, yet they held stubbornly, refusing to surrender. UN and South Korean forces relied heavily on air and naval support. American fighter jets patrolled the skies, bombing North Korean positions. Aircraft carriers offshore launched airstrikes. Artillery from the coast pounded enemy formations. But the North Koreans adapted, dispersing troops, attacking at night, and striking wherever weaknesses appeared. One of the most critical battles in this period was the fight at the Naktung River. North Korean divisions attempted to cross the river and break through the defensive line. UN soldiers, many inexperienced and outnumbered, held the banks with rifles, machine guns, and desperate courage. The river became a killing ground. Bodies and equipment swept downstream. Soldiers waded into waist-deep water under enemy fire. Every inch of territory contested. Every moment a life-or-death struggle. Despite the hardships, stories of heroism abounded. South Korean soldiers sacrificing themselves to cover retreats, medics running into crossfire to save the wounded, American units holding key positions even as their flanks collapsed, civilians assisting in defense, ferrying supplies, guiding troops, and tending to the injured. The human cost was enormous, yet determination remained. Meanwhile, North Korean commanders underestimated the resilience of the UN forces. They expected a swift collapse, yet the defenders adapted. Counterattacks were launched, artillery targeted supply lines. Sniper teams harassed advancing troops, and the defenders learned to use the terrain to their advantage. Every hilltop, every village, every road became a fortress. As September approached, the fighting intensified. North Korean troops attempted multiple breakthroughs, yet the perimeter held, slowly, painfully, inch by inch. The UN forces' ability to receive reinforcements from the sea was critical. Soldiers arriving by ship brought fresh troops. Weapons and morale supplies from the United States helped sustain the defenders. Every crate of ammunition, every ration of food, a lifeline amid the chaos. Civilians faced unimaginable hardship. Overcrowded refugee camps, diseases spreading rapidly, children orphaned or separated from parents, families hiding in fields and mountains. Yet even in these conditions, courage persisted. Some civilians volunteered to carry ammunition to front lines. Others provided intelligence about enemy movements. The line between soldier and civilian blurred. Survival required cooperation and bravery. By mid-September, the UN forces had solidified the perimeter. The North Korean advance had slowed, supply lines stretched, troops exhausted. Morale beginning to falter. General Walker knew that holding Pusan was vital, not only to protect lives, but to create an opportunity for a counteroffensive. The defense had to be stubborn, tenacious, and unyielding. Stories from this period reveal the intensity of human endurance. Men digging foxholes with bare hands, soldiers sleeping in mud-filled trenches, carrying the wounded under fire, improvising weapons and defenses. Each day became a test of courage. Each night, a battle against fear, hunger, and exhaustion. Meanwhile, the international stage responded. The United Nations passed resolutions condemning the North Korean invasion, pledging military support to South Korea. Air and naval reinforcements arrived. American troops increased in number. Advisors worked tirelessly to coordinate defenses. Yet uncertainty remained. The North Koreans still held superior numbers, their armored divisions capable of breaking lines. Every day could bring disaster. By the end of September, the Pusan perimeter had become a symbol, a last stand, a place where determination, courage, and desperation collided. Soldiers who had never fought before became veterans overnight. Commanders learned to make split-second decisions. Civilians became part of the struggle, and the world watched. The Korean War was no longer just a local conflict. It was a test of human will and the limits of endurance. And then, As the perimeter held, General MacArthur prepared a daring plan that would change the course of the war, an amphibious landing far behind enemy lines, aimed at cutting off North Korean supply lines. A gamble of immense risk, yet one that offered hope. The stage was set for the next chapter, where desperation would meet strategy, courage would face innovation, and the war would enter a new, decisive phase. By mid-September 1950, the Korean War had reached a critical point. The North Korean army had been stopped at the Pusan perimeter, yet the threat remained. UN forces were exhausted, supplies stretched thin, and the possibility of defeat still loomed. It was in this precarious moment that General Douglas MacArthur devised a plan that would become legendary, audacious, and extremely risky. The idea was simple, yet terrifying in its execution: an amphibious landing at Incheon, a port city on the western coast of Korea, far behind North Korean lines, designed to cut off enemy supply routes, encircle their troops, and recapture Seoul. The location was strategically perfect, but the terrain and tides made the landing perilous: narrow channels, rocky shores, tidal variations of up to 30 feet, fortified enemy positions. It was a gamble that many advisors called impossible. MacArthur, confident in his experience and intuition, pressed forward, insisting that the landing would change the course of the war, meticulously planning every detail, gathering intelligence, preparing naval and air support, coordinating timing, and rehearsing amphibious maneuvers. Secrecy was critical. The element of surprise had to be absolute. In the early hours of September 15, 1950, UN forces began their advance toward Incheon. The operation involved thousands of troops, landing craft, warships, and air support. Troops faced immediate danger even before reaching the beaches. North Korean defenders had fortified positions, machine gun nests, artillery batteries, obstacles in the water, mines. Yet the attackers pressed forward. The landing itself was a test of human courage and resilience. Soldiers disembarked from ships under fire, wading through water, mud, and obstacles. Enemy fire was intense. Bullets ricocheted, artillery shells exploded, chaos reigned. Yet soldiers moved with determination, keeping formation, advancing toward objectives, every step contested, every inch gained was paid for with blood. At the same time, air support was crucial. Fighter jets strafed enemy positions. Bombers targeted fortifications. Naval artillery pummeled coastal defenses. The coordination between land, sea, and air forces was unprecedented. Every second counted. Any delay could lead to disaster. Yet the landing progressed. Incheon's shores were slowly seized, and the element of surprise worked in the attackers' favor. Once the beachhead was secured, the advance toward Seoul began. North Korean forces were caught off guard, supply lines were severed, communication disrupted, morale shattered. Resistance was fierce in some pockets: sniper fire ambushes, booby traps. Yet UN forces pressed forward, determined to achieve a decisive victory. The battle for Seoul itself was brutal, urban warfare unlike anything seen so far in the conflict. Buildings became fortresses. Streets turned into kill zones. Every alley and rooftop could hide an enemy soldier. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, seeking shelter wherever possible. The city became a maze of danger, smoke and fire filling the air. UN and South Korean forces fought house to house, building by building, soldiers clearing rooms with rifles and grenades, the noise deafening, the destruction complete. Yet even amid chaos, acts of courage and humanity persisted. Soldiers carrying the wounded under fire, medics risking their lives, civilians helping guide troops. Stories of heroism and sacrifice emerged from every block. By September 26, after nearly 2 weeks of intense combat, Seoul was recaptured. The operation was a stunning success. North Korean forces were forced to retreat, supply lines cut. The strategic initiative had shifted. The Incheon landing had not only lifted morale but had changed the trajectory of the war. Yet victory came at a cost. Hundreds of soldiers were killed, thousands wounded. The city itself lay in ruins. Civilians suffered enormous hardship, lives disrupted, homes destroyed. The human toll was immense, and the fighting was far from over. North Korean forces would regroup. The war would continue. But the landing at Incheon proved that audacity and careful planning could alter the course of history. In the aftermath, MacArthur's gamble was celebrated, praised in military circles worldwide. Yet it was also a reminder that even the most brilliant plans depended on courage, endurance, and the will of ordinary soldiers facing extraordinary danger. The Korean War had entered a new phase from defensive desperation at Pusan to bold counteroffensives behind enemy lines, and as UN forces pressed northward, the stage was being set for the next chapter, the advance to the north, where triumph would meet unforeseen challenges, and the specter of Chinese intervention loomed. With the successful Incheon landing behind them, UN and South Korean forces seized the momentum. The North Korean army, once advancing with unstoppable force, was now in retreat. The tide of war had shifted, morale soared among the UN troops, and the South Korean population dared to hope. General MacArthur, confident in the success of his strategy, ordered forces to push past the 38th parallel, moving deep into North Korean territory. His goal was clear: to reunify Korea under the South's government, to destroy the North Korean People's Army's capacity to wage war, and to deliver a swift and decisive end to the conflict. By late September, UN forces crossed the 38th parallel, advancing into a land that many soldiers had never seen: villages, towns, and farmlands now under enemy control. The retreating North Korean forces left behind evidence of their rapid withdrawal: destroyed bridges, mined roads, abandoned equipment. Yet pockets of resistance remained. Guerrilla attacks harassed supply lines. Ambushes struck the advancing troops. Every mile gained was contested. The terrain of North Korea posed new challenges. Mountains and river valleys slowed movement. Cold nights and the unfamiliar landscape tested soldiers' endurance. Supply lines were stretched thin. Reinforcements took time to arrive. Every decision carried risk. Yet the UN forces pressed on, determined to maintain momentum. By October, Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, became the next objective. North Korean forces, though weakened, defended the city fiercely. Urban combat erupted, soldiers navigating streets and buildings. Mines and booby traps slowed progress. Civilians, terrified and confused, tried to flee or hide. The city became a maze of danger. The capture of Pyongyang on October 19 marked a significant victory. The city, symbolic of North Korean power, fell into UN hands. Flags of the UN and South Korea were raised. Yet the cost was high: casualties mounted, soldiers exhausted, and the question of how to secure the region loomed large. Even as UN forces celebrated, reports of Chinese troop movements along the Yalu River began to surface. Intelligence indicated that China was preparing to intervene. Mao Zedong viewed the UN advance as a direct threat to Chinese security. The presence of foreign troops so close to the border was unacceptable. The specter of a larger conflict loomed. Meanwhile, life for civilians in occupied territories was precarious. Shortages of food and medical supplies, fear of retribution from retreating North Korean units, uncertainty about the intentions of UN forces. Communities struggled to survive amid the chaos of war, yet hope persisted. Some towns attempted to rebuild, schools reopened, local administration tried to function. The resilience of ordinary people became apparent. As UN forces pushed further north, the North Korean army attempted to regroup. Smaller units carried out delaying actions, ambushes in mountain passes, sniper attacks, sabotage of supply routes. Yet their ability to mount large-scale resistance had been diminished. The momentum was in the hands of the UN, however. The situation was far from secure. Commanders recognized that the advance had extended supply lines, troops were overextended, and winter approached. The cold of northern Korea would test the endurance of all soldiers. Equipment could fail, roads could freeze, and reinforcements could be delayed. Every decision carried heightened risk. Reports from intelligence officers painted a worrying picture. Chinese forces were massing in secret, crossing the border in small units, training and preparing for intervention. They would not act immediately, but the potential threat required consideration. The war was no longer between North and South Korea alone. It was becoming a proxy battleground for larger powers. During the advance, soldiers faced not only enemy fire, but also the psychological toll of war, witnessing villages destroyed, civilians injured or killed, comrades falling in battle, exhaustion, hunger, and the constant fear of ambush or counterattack. Letters from home, small gestures of humanity, brief moments of rest, became lifelines to sanity. By November, UN forces had occupied nearly all of North Korea. The peninsula seemed close to reunification under the South, yet caution was advised. North Korean resistance remained, and the potential for Chinese intervention was real. Commanders debated strategy, whether to consolidate positions or push further. MacArthur remained determined to continue the advance, confident that victory was within reach. The capture of key cities, supply depots, and transportation hubs allowed UN forces to prepare for continued operations. Yet the human cost continued to rise. Soldiers faced extreme fatigue, winter clothing in short supply, medical services overwhelmed by casualties. Yet determination held. The drive to end the conflict was strong. Amid this, stories of courage continued to emerge, as soldiers carrying wounded comrades under fire, medics risking lives to save civilians, local guides assisting troops through treacherous terrain. Each act a reminder of the human capacity for bravery, even in the midst of chaos. As December approached, intelligence reports confirmed what many had feared: Chinese troops were crossing the Yalu River in preparation for large-scale intervention. The war that had begun as a North-South conflict was about to escalate into a larger, more complex struggle. The next phase would test the endurance, courage, and strategy of UN forces like never before. The advance to the north had achieved remarkable success. The momentum was with the UN, but overconfidence could prove dangerous. The stage was set for the next chapter, the intervention of China and the brutal battles that would follow. By late October 1950, UN forces had advanced deep into North Korean territory. Pyongyang had fallen, the northern cities were occupied, and the dream of reunification seemed within reach. Yet across the Yalu River, China was quietly preparing. Its leaders watched the advance with increasing alarm. Mao Zedong feared the presence of foreign troops on his border and the potential for a hostile government in neighboring Korea. Chinese intelligence reports indicated that UN forces were overstretched, supply lines thin, troops fatigued, and winter approaching. Conditions were ideal for a surprise intervention. Mao authorized the creation of the People's Volunteer Army. Soldiers would be deployed under secrecy, disguised as volunteers, to avoid direct confrontation with the United States officially. Yet their impact would be decisive. In November, Chinese forces began crossing the Yalu River, initially in small units. Reconnaissance, sabotage, and small-scale attacks. Their presence went largely undetected by UN forces, underestimated in size and capability. The soldiers, trained in harsh winter conditions, moved with stealth and discipline, ready to strike with overwhelming force. The first clashes were sudden and devastating. UN units advanced into mountainous regions, only to be ambushed by Chinese forces. Surprise attacks in the night, infiltration of defensive lines, artillery fire from hidden positions. Soldiers caught off guard. The effectiveness of the Chinese intervention shocked commanders. The war was no longer a straightforward UN advance. The Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, beginning in late November, became the defining episode of this intervention. The 1st Marine Division and supporting UN forces found themselves encircled by tens of thousands of Chinese troops in freezing winter temperatures, some as low as -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Men faced not only enemy fire, but frostbite, snow and exhaustion, equipment freezing, weapons malfunctioning. Every step forward a battle for survival. Chinese tactics were brutal and effective. Night attacks, human wave assaults, infiltration behind lines, cutting off supply and communication. The UN forces fought valiantly, holding positions, counterattacking when possible, soldiers improvising in extreme conditions. Every hilltop, every road, every ridge contested fiercely. The human cost was immense. Thousands killed, wounded, or missing, soldiers suffering from hypothermia, trapped in ice and snow, medics overwhelmed, evacuation nearly impossible. Yet amid the chaos, acts of extraordinary courage emerged. Marines and soldiers carrying the wounded through enemy fire, improvised defenses holding lines, leadership and resolve making the difference between survival and annihilation. Meanwhile, the wider strategic situation grew increasingly complex. UN forces had to withdraw to more defensible positions, retreating under constant attack. Winter, weather compounding the difficulty. The Chinese intervention had transformed the war, no longer just a north-south struggle. It was now a war of survival against a new, determined adversary. Civilians in the region faced unimaginable hardships. Caught between retreating UN forces and advancing Chinese troops, villages burned, homes destroyed, supply shortages worsening, winter hunger threatening lives. The civilian population endured with courage, helping the wounded, seeking shelter and navigating the chaos of war. By December, the Chosin Reservoir campaign had reached its climax. The UN forces executed a fighting withdrawal, facing relentless attacks, harsh terrain, and freezing conditions. Yet the withdrawal was conducted with discipline and courage, small units covering larger ones, soldiers sacrificing themselves to allow comrades to escape, coordination under fire, a testament to training and determination. The broader impact of Chinese intervention was clear. The war that had seemed almost won by UN forces now faced a brutal stalemate. The North Koreans were reinforced, supply lines disrupted, morale tested, commanders recalculating strategy. The intervention demonstrated the limits of conventional force, the unpredictability of war, and the harsh reality of fighting an enemy willing to endure extreme conditions. In the aftermath, survivors of the Chosin Reservoir spoke of heroism, endurance, and the thin line between life and death. Entire units decimated, yet cohesion maintained. Small victories within a larger struggle. The Korean War had entered a new, grueling phase, a war of attrition, of endurance, of courage against overwhelming odds. As winter deepened, the UN forces regrouped, strengthened defensive positions, called in reinforcements, and prepared for the coming battles, knowing that the Chinese intervention had changed everything. The war would not be a swift march to victory, it would be a prolonged, bitter conflict, testing soldiers, civilians, and commanders alike. The advance north had come to a halt. The Pusan perimeter had been reversed, territory lost and regained, lives destroyed and saved. The Chinese intervention had shown the unpredictability of war, the danger of underestimating an opponent, and the extraordinary resilience of human beings in the face of unimaginable adversity. The stage was set for the next chapter, the brutal battles along frozen mountains and river valleys, where courage, endurance, and strategy would be tested like never before, and where the Korean War would enter one of its most infamous campaigns. November 27, 1950, the frozen mountains of northeastern North Korea became the stage for one of the most brutal campaigns of the Korean War. The 1st Marine Division, supported by UN forces, had advanced deep into North Korean territory, confident after the recapture of Pyongyang. Yet they were about to face an enemy of overwhelming numbers. In one of the harshest environments imaginable, the Chosin Reservoir, a long, narrow body of water surrounded by rugged mountains, was both strategic and treacherous. Roads were limited, icy, and winding. Every bend could hide enemy troops. Artillery fire from the heights could devastate vehicles below. Temperatures plummeted to degrees Fahrenheit. Men's breath freezing in the air, weapons malfunctioning, radios failing, vehicles breaking down, and frostbite becoming as deadly as enemy fire. Chinese forces, organized into the People's Volunteer Army, had secretly infiltrated the area, their numbers vast, their morale high, trained for winter combat. Moving with stealth through the mountains, their plan was to encircle UN forces, cut off supply lines, and destroy the advancing troops. The Marines were unaware of the scale of the threat. They would soon learn. The battle began with sudden attacks in the night. Chinese troops surged from the mountains, surrounding positions, infiltrating defensive lines, using human wave tactics, and exploiting every weakness. Artillery and mortar fire rained down every position contested fiercely. Yet the Marines held small units defending key roads, machine guns blazing, rifles firing relentlessly, grenades thrown into advancing waves. Every inch of ground fought over with desperation. The weather compounded the danger. Snow and ice slowed movement. Frostbite incapacitated soldiers. Water bottles froze. Ammunition and food became scarce. Carrying the wounded through icy terrain became a Herculean task. Yet leadership, discipline, and sheer willpower enabled the forces to maintain cohesion. One of the most critical aspects of the battle was the ability of small units to fight in isolation. Platoons cut off from the main body, surrounded by enemy troops, yet holding positions, improvising defenses, creating obstacles with vehicles, rocks, and fallen trees. These actions delayed Chinese advances, allowed other units to regroup, and prevented total encirclement. Medical teams worked tirelessly, under fire, treating frostbite, gunshot wounds, and injuries from explosions. Evacuation was nearly impossible in the freezing terrain, yet lives were saved as soldiers carried comrades on their backs, dragged stretchers over ice, risking everything to keep each other alive. Acts of courage multiplied across the battlefield. The roads leading out of Chasen Reservoir became lifelines and battlefields. Convoys moved slowly, under constant threat from ambushes and artillery fire. Vehicles struggled through snow and ice, drivers balancing survival with the need to transport supplies. Each mile gained was a small victory, every successful retreat a testament to training, coordination, and endurance. The withdrawal from the Chasen Reservoir was itself an epic feat. UN forces executed a fighting retreat, every position contested, delaying the Chinese advance, allowing the majority of troops and civilians to escape. Marines covering each other, artillery providing suppressive fire, engineers clearing obstacles and mines, coordination under fire demonstrating extraordinary discipline. Amid the chaos, individual acts of heroism stood out. Soldiers charging enemy positions alone, rescuing comrades from frozen terrain, holding bridges against impossible odds. Small squads destroying enemy machine guns to protect the larger force. These stories would be remembered for decades, a testament to courage and resilience. By December 13, 1950, the withdrawal was complete. UN forces had managed to escape encirclement. Casualties were heavy, thousands killed or wounded. Yet the operation was a strategic success. The bulk of the 1st Marine Division had survived, and the enemy's advance was slowed. The battlefield, though claimed in part by Chinese forces, had demonstrated the endurance of UN troops. The human cost was enormous. Frostbite, starvation, and exhaustion had taken a toll. Soldiers faced both enemy fire and the merciless environment. The extreme cold tested the limits of human endurance, yet morale remained intact. The ability to continue fighting despite unimaginable conditions defined the battle. The Battle of Chasen Reservoir became a defining moment, a symbol of human resilience, the capacity to endure and adapt in the face of overwhelming odds. The withdrawal preserved fighting strength, allowed UN forces to regroup, and set the stage for future operations. As the survivors regrouped southward, the Korean War had entered a new phase. Chinese intervention had proven decisive. The conflict was no longer a straightforward march of UN forces. It was now a grueling war of attrition, endurance, and courage. The lessons learned at Chasen would inform military strategy, leadership decisions, and the understanding of human limits in combat. The battle had also reshaped the strategic situation. The UN advance was halted. North Korea remained in play. Chinese forces continued to reinforce positions. The war was far from over, and the winter of 1950 would mark a turning point, not only in terms of military operations, but also in the resolve and spirit of the soldiers who fought there. By early 1951, after the brutal fighting at Chasen Reservoir and the back-and-forth offensives across Korea, the war had entered a grueling phase of stalemate. Both sides had suffered enormous casualties, and the front lines had stabilized near the 38th parallel. The terrain, mountains, and rivers forming natural defensive barriers, made rapid movement almost impossible. The Korean winter had ended, but the spring thaw brought its own challenges. Mud and flooding slowed troop movements. Vehicles and supply convoys bogged down, communications disrupted, artillery and small arms fire becoming constant, almost a daily accompaniment to the soldiers' existence. Life at the front meant long hours in trenches, foxholes, and bunkers. Under the constant threat of enemy observation and sudden attack, trench warfare in Korea was brutal. Soldiers faced a combination of cold, mud, and relentless combat. Defensive positions were dug into hillsides, reinforced with sandbags, timber, and whatever materials could be scavenged. Observation posts perched precariously on ridgelines, always vulnerable to sniper fire, artillery barrages, or sudden infantry assaults. Supply lines became critical. Both sides relied on trucks, porters, and improvised methods to move food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Raids on supply convoys could cripple units, and capturing enemy supplies often meant the difference between survival and disaster. Soldiers scavenged whatever they could: rations, weapons, and clothing. Every resource counted. Life in the trenches was grueling, boredom mixed with terror. Soldiers wrote letters home, repaired weapons, dug latrines, and tried to find moments of rest amidst the chaos. Disease was a constant threat. Dysentery, frostbite, and infections from minor wounds claimed more lives than combat at times. Morale depended on camaraderie, humor, and small comforts: cigarettes, canned food, letters from home, and the rare hot meal. Skirmishes became almost daily events. Artillery duels erupted at dawn. Sniper fire targeted anyone exposing themselves. Patrols probed enemy lines, looking for weaknesses. Ambushes were common, and both sides studied the terrain meticulously. Every hill, every ridge, every valley became a potential advantage or deadly trap. One notable feature of this phase of the war was the increasing use of technology and tactics to break the deadlock. Artillery fire was coordinated to target supply lines and bunkers. Air support from jets and helicopters provided reconnaissance, and both sides experimented with infiltration tactics to bypass strong points. Yet the rugged terrain and entrenched defenses made decisive victories rare. Casualties continued to mount, the human cost weighing heavily on both sides. Soldiers endured constant exposure, lack of sleep, and mental strain. Letters from home carried hope, but also reminders of what was at stake. Fear and determination coexisted in every unit, shaping the psychology of a war without clear front lines. Despite the stalemate, acts of heroism continued. Small unit leaders distinguished themselves by holding positions under overwhelming odds, rescuing wounded under fire, or leading counterattacks to reclaim lost ground. Medics and engineers displayed extraordinary bravery, often risking life and limb to keep lines intact. Every soldier contributed. Every action mattered in a war of attrition. Negotiations for a ceasefire had begun, but progress was slow. Mistrust, political considerations, and the unresolved tension between North and South Korea meant that combat continued. Soldiers adapted to a rhythm of patrols, fortification, and sporadic attacks, knowing that the front line might shift at any moment. The psychological toll was immense: constant vigilance, sudden artillery barrages, the sounds of distant fighting, and the knowledge that death could come without warning. Yet soldiers found ways to endure. Camaraderie, letters, humor, and small victories provided a lifeline, allowing them to maintain focus and resilience. By mid-1951, the stalemate had solidified. Front lines resembled a checkerboard of fortified hills, barbed wire, and bunkers, with patrols probing enemy positions, occasional attacks attempting to gain a few hundred yards. The human cost continued to mount, but both sides had learned the limits of conventional offensives. The war had become a grinding contest of endurance, strategy, and courage. This phase also saw innovation in medical care and logistics. field hospitals became more mobile, surgical techniques improved, and evacuation procedures were refined. Helicopters began to play a crucial role, transporting the wounded from remote or dangerous positions, saving countless lives that would previously have been lost. Soldiers who survived this period emerged hardened, aware of the physical and mental limits of human endurance. Every day was a test of patience, skill, and resilience. Each defensive line held, each counterattack repelled, contributed to the larger effort. In a war where progress was measured in inches, not miles, the stalemate in Korea would persist for years, shaping tactics, international diplomacy, and the lives of millions. Yet within this grinding phase, individual stories of courage, survival, and determination continued to define the human experience of war. As the war settled into stalemate, both sides increasingly relied on air and naval power to influence the battlefield. The skies over Korea became a constant theater of conflict, jets streaking overhead, propeller-driven aircraft still engaged in dogfights, reconnaissance missions gathering intelligence on enemy positions, and bombing raids targeting supply lines and fortifications. The United States Air Force and Navy brought unprecedented firepower to bear. B-29 bombers flew high-altitude missions, dropping tons of bombs on strategic targets, railways, bridges, and troop concentrations, while fighter jets like the F-86 Sabre clashed with MiG-15s in the first large-scale jet-versus-jet battles in history. The introduction of jet aircraft changed the dynamics of air warfare. Speed, altitude, and maneuverability became decisive factors. Dogfights over MiG Alley, the northwestern region of Korea near the Yalu River, became legendary. UN pilots engaged in deadly encounters with skilled North Korean and Chinese aviators. Every engagement carried the risk of death, mechanical failure, or capture. Stories of individual heroism emerged. Pilots pushing their planes to the limit, saving comrades, or evading impossible odds. Naval forces played an equally vital role. The United States Navy imposed a near-total blockade on North Korea. Aircraft carriers launched strikes against coastal targets, and amphibious ships supported ground operations. The Korean coastline became a battleground of artillery, naval gunfire, and amphibious landings. Supply routes were disrupted, reinforcements delayed, and morale on both sides affected. Helicopters, still relatively new in warfare, began to demonstrate their strategic value, transporting troops and evacuating wounded from difficult terrain. Their ability to bypass roads blocked by mud artillery or enemy troops saved countless lives and allowed commanders to maintain pressure on critical positions. Air power was not without risk. Anti-aircraft fire, unpredictable weather, and mechanical failures claimed many aircraft and crews. Pilots faced long missions over hostile territory, constantly aware that one mistake could be fatal. The psychological strain of air warfare was intense. The roar of engines, explosions, and the sight of comrades falling haunted survivors. Naval bombardments also carried risks. Coastal defenses fired upon warships, mines threatened shipping lanes, and the coordination of air and sea attacks required meticulous planning. Yet the results were undeniable. Ports were destroyed, supply lines disrupted, and enemy positions weakened, contributing to the overall UN strategy of attrition. The combination of air and naval power altered the pace and scope of the conflict. Ground forces adapted, developing anti-aircraft defenses, camouflage techniques, and countermeasures to naval bombardments. Artillery units worked in tandem with aircraft, targeting enemy positions with precision. The integration of air, sea, and ground operations became a defining feature of modern warfare. Individual acts of bravery continued to shine. Helicopter pilots flying into hot zones to rescue wounded, Navy sailors manning gunners under fire, and pilots risking capture to complete reconnaissance. These stories highlighted human courage amidst technological advancement, showing that machines could enhance, but not replace, the human element in war. By late 1951, the air war had reached new intensity. F-86 pilots gained dominance over MiG-15s, but losses remained high. The Navy maintained a relentless presence along the coast, supporting ground offensives, and protecting shipping. Helicopters and transport aircraft increased mobility, but weather and terrain continued to challenge operations. Air and naval engagements also influenced diplomacy. Both sides understood that control of the skies and seas could pressure the opposing leadership. Strategic bombings and naval blockades demonstrated capability and the willingness to escalate. Yet the risk of drawing other nations further into the conflict remained. The war in the air and at sea continued for years, shaping tactics, influencing morale, and demonstrating the increasing complexity of modern warfare. Soldiers and sailors alike understood that the conflict was no longer confined to trenches and hills, but spanned skies, rivers, and coastlines. While large-scale battles dominated headlines, a quieter, but no less deadly, struggle unfolded behind the lines. Guerrilla tactics and intelligence operation shaped the Korean War in ways few outsiders fully understood. Small groups of partisans, often local civilians and specialized military units, carried out sabotage ambushes and reconnaissance, striking when the enemy least expected it, in the rugged mountains and dense forests. Guerrilla fighters disrupted supply lines, destroyed bridges, and raided depots, often slipping away before conventional forces could respond. These operations required intimate knowledge of the terrain and a willingness to accept constant danger. Every mission carried the possibility of capture, torture, or death. Yet these fighters persisted. Knowing that their efforts could tip the balance, intelligence became the invisible front. Commanding officers relied on scouts as spies and intercepted communications to make decisions. Code-breaking units worked tirelessly, attempting to decipher enemy messages, while field agents risked their lives to pass along crucial information. Even small details, troop movements, supply shortages, or hidden fortifications could have enormous consequences. The CIA and UN intelligence units coordinated covert operations, providing weapons, training, and supplies to guerrilla groups behind enemy lines. These operations aimed to weaken the enemy from within and gather information that conventional forces could exploit. The complexity of coordinating such missions across hostile territory demanded ingenuity and nerves of steel. North Korean and Chinese forces responded with counterintelligence measures, infiltration, counterespionage, and surveillance. Any suspected collaboration with the enemy could result in execution. Fear and mistrust permeated occupied areas, making the work of spies, informants, and local guides perilous. Yet the impact of intelligence gathering was undeniable. Successful ambushes, timely reinforcements, and disrupted logistics, often hinged on a single tip or intercepted message. Guerrilla operations extended beyond sabotage. Psychological warfare became a key tool. Leaflets, radio broadcasts, and propaganda sought to undermine morale, sow doubt, and encourage defection. Both sides recognized that victory was not only a matter of territory, but also of the human mind, influencing soldiers and civilians alike. Special Forces units emerged as experts in these operations. The South Korean White Tigers and U.S. Army Ranger teams conducted raids, reconnaissance, and unconventional assaults, training focused on survival, navigation, hand-to-hand combat, and the ability to adapt to any situation. These units often operated deep behind enemy lines, isolated, outnumbered, relying on stealth and skill to survive. Capturing and interrogating enemy operatives provided critical insights, but also moral dilemmas. Prisoners could hold secrets that might save lives. Yet coercion carried the risk of misinformation or international condemnation. Officers learned to balance necessity with ethics, a constant challenge. In a war filled with shades of gray, local populations played an essential role, providing shelter, food, and intelligence, or, in some cases, betraying one side to the other. The civilian struggle added another layer of complexity. Ordinary people became actors in a war they did not choose, their lives intertwined with military strategy, resistance, and survival. The combination of guerrilla tactics and intelligence shaped campaigns in subtle but decisive ways. Conventional battles could be won or lost based on information gathered weeks or months earlier. Supply lines disrupted by partisans could halt offensives, and unexpected ambushes could demoralize even the most seasoned units. By 1952, both sides had learned the harsh lessons of unconventional warfare. Patrols were cautious, supply convoys heavily guarded, and networks of informants carefully cultivated. Every operation required planning, secrecy, and an acceptance of the inherent risks. The invisible war behind the front lines was relentless, unglamorous, yet essential. By late 1951, the Korean War had settled into a grinding stalemate. Front lines shifted, little trenches became entrenched, and the brutality of combat continued unabated. Both sides faced immense losses, yet neither could claim decisive victory. The war had become a test of endurance, supply, and political will. Negotiations began in earnest at Kaesong and later Panmunjom. But progress was slow. Each side insisted on conditions that reflected deep mistrust. Prisoners of war became a major sticking point. North Korea and China demanded repatriation, while the United Nations and South Korea sought voluntary returns. Discussions dragged on, punctuated by sporadic fighting, artillery duels, and raids that reminded negotiators of the stakes. The political landscape influenced military decisions. Washington, Beijing, and Moscow watched closely. Each sought to maximize influence without escalating into a broader conflict. The Cold War backdrop added tension. Every attack, every counterattack, carried implications far beyond the Korean peninsula. Life along the front lines settled into a grim rhythm. Soldiers endured harsh winters, monsoon rains, and constant artillery fire. Trenches were mud-filled, foxholes offered scant protection, and the threat of sniper fire or mines was ever present. Medical units worked tirelessly, treating frostbite, shrapnel wounds, and infectious diseases. Yet casualties continued to mount. Despite the stalemate, acts of heroism and humanity persisted. Soldiers saved comrades under fire, shared scarce rations with civilians, and documented the war through letters and photographs. The human element remained central, reminding all that even in a frozen conflict, courage and compassion endured. Meanwhile, diplomats continued their delicate work. Proposals for armistice, buffer zones, and monitoring committees were debated. Each detail required careful negotiation. Every concession was weighed against military realities and national pride. The process was painstaking, yet ultimately essential to ending the bloodshed. In July 1953, after 2 years of negotiation, the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed, establishing the Korean Demilitarized Zone and effectively freezing the conflict. Soldiers returned home, but the scars of war lingered, physically, psychologically, and politically. Families mourned lost loved ones, cities rebuilt, and memories of battle shaped the next generations. The armistice did not bring peace, only a cessation of active hostilities. North and South Korea remained divided, heavily fortified, and suspicious of each other. The Cold War continued, influencing global alliances and military strategies. Korea became a symbol of unresolved conflict, a reminder of the cost of war and the difficulty of reconciliation. The guns fell silent, but the echoes of the Korean War resonated for decades. Soldiers returned home, many carrying physical injuries, others burdened with invisible wounds, shell shock, post-traumatic stress, and the lingering memories of loss and destruction. Families struggled to reintegrate veterans, while communities rebuilt cities and infrastructure shattered by relentless bombardment. Politically, the war solidified the division of Korea, creating two nations with opposing ideologies. South Korea embraced democracy and aligned with Western powers. North Korea entrenched a totalitarian regime under the Kim dynasty. The demilitarized zone became both a physical barrier and a symbol of ideological confrontation. A tense peace prevailed, punctuated by skirmishes, espionage, and occasional provocations. Globally, the Korean War shaped the course of the Cold War. The United States reaffirmed its commitment to containing communism, stationing troops permanently in East Asia, forging alliances with Japan, South Korea, and other nations. China emerged as a formidable military power, demonstrating willingness to intervene abroad. and the Soviet Union refined its strategy of supporting allies without direct engagement militarily. Lessons from the Korean War influenced doctrine and strategy for years to come. Combined arms operations, air superiority, and the integration of intelligence and guerrilla tactics proved vital. The conflict underscored the importance of logistics, battlefield adaptability, and coordination among multinational forces. Tank battles, amphibious assaults, and airborne operations provided case studies for future military planners. The human cost remained stark. Over 2 million civilians perished. Millions more were wounded or displaced. Soldiers endured extreme conditions, facing frostbite, malnutrition, and constant combat stress. POWs suffered harsh treatment, with some enduring years of captivity. Monuments, memorials, and museums across Korea and abroad preserve the stories of these individuals, ensuring that their sacrifices are not forgotten. Medical advancements emerged as a legacy as well. Field hospitals refined trauma care, evacuation procedures improved, and psychological support for soldiers became a recognized necessity. Lessons in triage, battlefield medicine, and rehabilitation influenced later conflicts, saving countless lives in subsequent wars. The Korean War also highlighted the importance of international cooperation. The United Nations' role in coordinating multinational forces demonstrated both strengths and limitations. Collective security required compromise, shared strategy, and respect for differing national interests. This experience informed future UN peacekeeping missions, shaping expectations and operational protocols. Culturally, the war left its imprint through literature, film, and oral histories. Memoirs of soldiers, accounts of civilians, and documentaries captured the raw realities of the battlefield. These stories humanized the statistics, bringing to light the experiences of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. They became lessons in courage, endurance, and the complexities of human conflict. Educationally, the war became a subject of study for military academies, political scientists, and historians. Its unresolved conclusion offered a case study in limited war, Cold War dynamics, and the challenges of negotiating peace under global tension. Scholars examined strategies, leadership decisions, and the interplay between politics and combat, deriving insights that continue to inform military and diplomatic theory. Finally, the war's legacy is deeply personal for veterans and families. Remembrance ceremonies, reunions, and storytelling preserve the memory of those who fought for nations. The lessons inform defense policy, alliances, and preparedness. And for the world, the Korean War stands as a testament to resilience, a cautionary tale of ideological conflict, and a reminder that even limited wars carry immense human cost. War is often measured in statistics, troop movements, and strategic gains, yet the true cost of conflict is found in the stories of those who lived it: the soldiers in the trenches, the medics on the front lines, the civilians caught between advancing armies in Korea. These personal experiences reveal the human dimension of a war often called the Forgotten War. Private James McAllister of the United States Army recalled the bitter winter of 1950. Temperatures plunged well below freezing, snowdrifts blocked supply lines, and frostbite claimed fingers and toes as readily as enemy bullets. He remembered crawling through icy mud, helping wounded comrades, and writing letters home by candlelight. Each day was a test of endurance, each night a struggle against fear and exhaustion. In contrast, Sergeant Kim Soo-hyun, a South Korean soldier defending the Pusan perimeter, described the relentless pressure of defending against waves of North Korean forces. Trenches were cramped, artillery fire constant, yet camaraderie and shared purpose gave soldiers strength. Kim recalled moments of quiet reflection between battles, talking with friends about dreams of peace, of returning home to families, and of surviving another day. Civilians, too, endured unimaginable hardships. In Seoul, families fled advancing troops, carrying meager possessions on foot, facing hunger, disease, and bombardment. Some were separated from loved ones for months, others never reunited. Yet amidst despair, Stories of solidarity and kindness persisted. Neighbors shared food, strangers offered shelter, and small acts of humanity illuminated the darkness of war. Medics played a crucial role. Lieutenant Margaret Thompson, a nurse with the U.S. Army, treated endless streams of wounded soldiers and civilians alike. She recalled the challenge of improvising supplies, working under constant threat of attack, and witnessing both the fragility and resilience of life. Thompson's diaries reflect moments of sorrow, triumph, and the quiet dignity of saving lives in the midst of chaos. Prisoners of war endured extreme conditions in Chinese captivity. Some UN soldiers faced harsh labor, indoctrination attempts, and limited rations. Yet letters and memoirs reveal how camaraderie, mental resilience, and small acts of defiance helped prisoners survive. Shared stories and memories of home sustained them, reinforcing the strength of human spirit under adversity. The experiences of foreign volunteers and advisors also left lasting impressions. Australian, British, and Canadian troops brought unique perspectives, sharing their tactics, learning local conditions, and forging bonds with Korean soldiers. These interactions shaped multinational cooperation and left memories of cross-cultural camaraderie in the crucible of battle. Amidst the horrors, moments of levity and humanity endured. Soldiers exchanged jokes in foxholes, shared cigarettes, and celebrated small victories. Civilians found joy in fleeting moments. Children played among ruins when it was safe, and families preserved traditions to maintain a sense of normalcy. These glimpses of life beyond combat remind us that humanity persists even in war's darkest hours. Letters, diaries, and photographs from the Korean War preserve these personal narratives. They allow us to hear voices otherwise lost in history, to feel the fear, hope, and determination of those who lived the conflict. They are testimonies of courage, endurance, and the unbreakable human spirit. War often drives innovation, and the Korean War was no exception. It became a testing ground for new technologies, tactics, and strategies. The conflict highlighted the evolving nature of modern warfare, where mechanized units, air power, and communications technology reshaped the battlefield. Air power played a decisive role. Jet aircraft were used in large-scale combat for the first time in history. The U.S. introduced the F-86 Sabre, while North Korean and Chinese forces used MiG-15 jets. Dogfights in the skies over Korea were frequent. Pilots tested limits of speed, maneuverability, and aerial tactics. The Battle of MiG Alley became legendary, showcasing the emergence of jet combat as a dominant force in modern warfare. Helicopters were deployed extensively. Initially used for medical evacuation and reconnaissance, they demonstrated unmatched versatility, saving countless lives by rapidly transporting wounded soldiers from front lines to field hospitals. Their use set a precedent for helicopter operations in Vietnam and subsequent conflicts. Tanks and armored vehicles evolved as well. The rugged Korean terrain tested the durability and mobility of armored units. American M4 Shermans and M26 Pershings, alongside newer Patton tanks, clashed with North Korean T-34s. Tank tactics had to adapt to hilly landscapes, narrow valleys, and unpredictable ambushes. Engineers developed innovative methods to overcome obstacles, including improvised bridges and mine-clearing techniques. Communications technology became crucial. The Korean War saw the widespread use of radios for coordination. Field commanders relied on real-time information to manage troop movements. Signals intelligence was integrated into operations, and cryptography ensured that strategic plans remained secure. These systems highlighted the importance of information superiority on the battlefield. Artillery and logistics were critical components. Both sides employed heavy bombardments to soften enemy positions. U.S. and UN forces innovated precision targeting methods using aerial reconnaissance. Meanwhile, logistical planning ensured that frontline units were supplied despite harsh winters, mountainous terrain, and disrupted supply lines. Efficient supply chains often determined the success or failure of offensives. Medical technology advanced rapidly. Mobile surgical units were deployed closer to combat zones. Innovations in triage, blood transfusion, and infection control saved thousands of lives. Field hospitals became more efficient, and the lessons learned informed future military medicine, including in Vietnam and beyond. Special operations and reconnaissance tactics evolved. Small, highly trained units conducted raids, gathered intelligence, and disrupted enemy supply lines. These missions demonstrated the value of stealth, adaptability, and local knowledge. Lessons from these operations influenced the development of modern special forces doctrine worldwide. Naval technology and amphibious warfare also played a pivotal role. The U.S. landing at Incheon demonstrated the strategic value of amphibious assaults, naval gunfire support. Aircraft carriers and troop transports were integrated effectively into joint operations. Coordination between sea, air, and land units became a model for future conflicts. Even everyday battlefield technology, such as cold weather gear and portable communication devices, evolved. Soldiers endured extreme conditions. Frostbite and snow blindness were common. Yet innovations in clothing, heating, and protective equipment improved survival rates. Portable radios and signal equipment allowed units to maintain contact despite challenging terrain. The Korean War became a crucible for testing modern warfare concepts: jet combat, helicopters, tank tactics, logistics, field medicine, amphibious operations, and communications all underwent refinement under fire. The innovations developed during this conflict shaped military doctrine for decades, influencing tactics in Vietnam, the Middle East, and modern peacekeeping missions. Ultimately, technology and innovation were only effective when combined with human courage, strategy, and adaptability. Weapons, vehicles, and communications could amplify effectiveness, but the determination of soldiers, the ingenuity of commanders, and the resilience of civilians determined the ultimate outcome. The Korean War reshaped the global political landscape. Its effects reverberated far beyond the Korean peninsula. The conflict intensified the Cold War, solidified alliances, and influenced international policies for decades. Understanding the geopolitical consequences of the war is essential to grasp its historical significance. Before the war, the world was still recovering from World War II. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers. Tensions simmered over ideology, influence, and territorial control. Korea became a frontline in this global confrontation, with the North backed by the Soviet Union and China, and the South supported by the United States and UN forces. Korea became a proxy battleground for the Cold War. The war confirmed the policy of containment. The United States and its allies adopted a strategy aimed at preventing the spread of communism. This approach defined U.S. foreign policy for decades. Military commitments increased worldwide. The war demonstrated that the U.S. would intervene militarily to defend nations threatened by communist expansion. The United Nations' role was also strengthened. Korea marked the first major military action conducted under UN authority. While challenges and political disagreements existed, the coalition of forces from multiple countries demonstrated the potential for collective security. The success of coordinating multinational operations became a precedent for future peacekeeping missions. China's entry into the war reshaped Asian geopolitics. The People's Republic of China, newly established in 1949, asserted itself as a military power. By intervening to support North Korea, China signaled its willingness to defend its interests and project influence. This had lasting implications for U.S.-China relations, border security, and regional diplomacy. The war also influenced Japan's post-war security policy. The U.S. relied on bases in Japan for operations, reinforcing Japan's strategic importance. The conflict accelerated rearmament debates and shaped Japan's economic recovery, transforming it into a critical ally in East Asia. Europe watched closely. NATO, established in 1949, perceived the Korean War as a warning. The conflict underscored the threat of communist expansion beyond Europe. Military strategies and defense budgets were reevaluated. European nations strengthened alliances with the U.S., deepening the division between Eastern and Western blocs. The Korean War affected future conflicts worldwide. Vietnam, the Middle East, and later Cold War hotspots drew lessons from Korea. Policymakers studied the limits of conventional warfare against ideologically driven adversaries. Air power, amphibious operations, and coalition tactics were analyzed, shaping strategy in subsequent decades. Economically, the war spurred military production and technological innovation. Industries supplying weapons, vehicles, and equipment expanded. Advances in logistics, medicine, and engineering flowed into civilian sectors. In South Korea, UN support helped rebuild infrastructure, laying foundations for future economic growth. Politically, South Korea consolidated under anti-communist leadership. North Korea became increasingly isolated. The war entrenched division, transforming the 38th parallel into a symbol of Cold War rivalry. The enduring tension continues to influence diplomacy, military planning, and international relations today. The human cost influenced global perceptions of war. Refugee crises, civilian casualties, and POW experiences drew international attention. Humanitarian aid and post-war reconstruction efforts became central to foreign policy. The Korean War demonstrated that ideological conflicts carried profound human consequences, shaping how nations approached intervention and reconstruction. In essence, the Korean War was more than a regional conflict. It was a pivotal episode in the Cold War affecting alliances, military strategy, economic policy, and international relations. Its lessons remain relevant, reminding the world of the interconnectedness of military action, politics, and human consequences. The Korean War ended in an armistice on July 27, 1953, but the absence of a formal peace treaty means that technically, North and South Korea remain at war. This unresolved status shapes both nations' politics, military policies, and international relations. The legacy of the war continues to influence the Korean Peninsula and the world. For South Korea, the war forged a sense of national identity. Survival and resilience became central themes. Cities rebuilt from ruins, industrialization accelerated, and democracy gradually strengthened. Memorials, museums, and annual ceremonies honor soldiers and civilians alike, reminding generations of the sacrifices made for freedom. In North Korea, the war is central to the regime's narrative. It emphasizes heroism, resistance against foreign aggression, and the legitimacy of the state. The conflict is portrayed as a sacred struggle, shaping education, culture, and political ideology. The memories of war serve both as warning and justification, reinforcing the state's policies. For veterans, the war left lasting physical and psychological scars. Soldiers faced harsh combat, freezing winters, and the trauma of survival. Many struggled with reintegration into civilian life. PTSD, injuries, and memories of comrades lost haunted them. Veterans organizations and memorial initiatives preserve their stories, ensuring that personal sacrifices are not forgotten. Internationally, the Korean War influenced global consciousness. It highlighted the human cost of Cold War confrontations, strengthened alliances such as NATO, and shaped UN peacekeeping operations. Historians study Korea to understand modern warfare, ideological conflict, and coalition operations. The war remains a crucial case study for military strategists and policymakers. Culturally, films, literature, and art depict Korea's war experience, from South Korean cinema to international documentaries. These works explore heroism, suffering, and the moral complexities of war. They contribute to collective memory, shaping how future generations perceive the conflict. Technologically, lessons from the Korean War informed later military innovation. Jet fighters, helicopters, medical evacuation systems, and mechanized infantry tactics evolved from wartime experience. These advancements influenced conflicts in Vietnam, the Middle East, and beyond, demonstrating how necessity drives innovation during war. The Korean War also shaped humanitarian approaches. Refugee management, POW treatment, and post-war reconstruction strategies informed global policies. Relief organizations refined their methods, responding more effectively to civilian suffering in later conflicts. The war's memory is a bridge connecting past sacrifices to present realities. It reminds the world that geopolitical struggles are never abstract. They affect real lives, families, and communities. Memorials along the 38th parallel, veterans' cemeteries, and museums in Seoul and Pyongyang preserve these lessons, ensuring the war's impact is neither forgotten nor repeated. Ultimately, the legacy of the Korean War lies in its lessons, in resilience and loss, in the courage of soldiers and civilians, in the shaping of modern geopolitics. It serves as a reminder of the costs of unresolved conflict, the value of diplomacy, and the enduring strength of human spirit even in the darkest of times. The Korean War may have ended on the battlefield, but its echoes continue to shape history and our understanding of courage, sacrifice, and humanity.